Um, all right, let's start. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Gilbert Wesso, and I'm the Chief Researcher in the Research Unit, which is located within the Knowledge and Information Services Division in Parliament. Ms. Ubrechts from Unicef and I will be your program facilitator for this webinar dealing with what progress have we made in advancing the equal and optimal development, protection, and well-being of children. I will introduce staff from Parliament, and Ms. Ubrechts will introduce the UNICEF country reps and presenters. Now, before we start, just a few protocol matters to take note of. Please raise your hand on the Zoom platform when you wish to speak. Camera should remain off and microphones on mute unless recognized to speak on the platform. Please switch your camera on while speaking. This will also be required for your YouTube screenings. Please identify yourself when asking a question. A 10-minute question time will be allowed after the first 3 presentations. Also use the Q&A or the chat options in Zoom to raise questions if needed. The presenters should please stay within the time slots provided in the program. Presentations will be available on a link which we will forward to all webinar delegates. Please note that this webinar is the first of many to come, and we are absolutely delighted to have the Speaker of the National Assembly, Honorable Mapisa Nkakula, who will provide the opening remarks, as well as the Chairperson of the NCOP, Honorable Masondo, who will provide closing remarks towards the end of the program. Honorable Masondo just called in that he will be a little bit late. We also wish to say a heartwarming welcome to the Chair of the Portfolio Committee on Social Development, Honorable Mbana, and Honorable Members of Parliament, the Department of Social Development, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, senior staff from UNICEF, Stats SA, the Children's Institute, SA Civil Society Coalition for Children's Rights, our senior managers from Parliament, and last but not least, our most esteemed program participants and colleagues. So without further ado, I will now hand over to the Honorable Mapisa Nkakula, who will kindly grace us with the opening remarks. Madam Speaker, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Chairperson, the UNICEF representative, Ms. Christine Muhigana, Chairperson of the NCOP, Honorable Masondo, presenters and guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. This morning, we convene on the online virtual platform to have a discussion that should be regarded as having the biggest bearing on the future of our country and society. It is unfortunately also one of those areas that have continued to receive inadequate attention and focus, at least when it comes to concrete efforts for implementation and impact. As correctly captured in the spirit of our 2008 Memorandum of Understanding with UNICEF, the success of a proper and comprehensive early childhood development strategy is the basis on which we build a better South Africa and a better future for all. This is particularly so because in South Africa, not only are we dealing with the future consequences of not doing something about this now, but we are also helping to perpetuate a damaging legacy of the past from which we have come. Chairperson and members of the panel, it was somewhere in the halls of this parliamentary precinct that we still occupy today. In 1953, hardly 5 years after their rise to power, that the Nationalist Party passed into law the Bantu Education Bill. They did so after being persuaded by the expressed views of the then Minister of Native Affairs, Hendrik Verwoerd, about the intent and purpose of passing such a law. It was from a podium of this House of Parliament that Verwoerd made his infamous 1953 speech, in which he declared, and I quote, "There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice?" Close quote. And for more than 40 years after this, our children were subjected to an education system that ensured that they have no meaningful role to play in the development of their own country, and that they should forever remain tools of labor at the hand of the white apartheid system. The legacy of this action by Verwoerd's government and parliament still impacts South Africa's capacity for socio-economic advancement and development to this day. The political regulation of basic education policy, although important for such outcomes, was not the only factor in this grand scheme to devalue the worth of and potential of the African child. Verwoerd also knew that the conditions under which these children would grow, their quality of life, the stability of their homes, access to basic amenities, exposure to violence, will all affect their psychological makeup and define the character of adults they were to become. Many of you participating in this webinar may remember that before the passing of the Bantu Education Act in 1953, the basic education of children in this country was not under the control of the state and the minister. It has always been managed by the education providers, including in the main then, the various religious missionaries from the West. This system did not discriminate about the quality and content of education provided to Black children. This was evident in the kinds of Black leaders and professionals produced in this pre-Bantu education era of no state control. It is exactly this preparation and equipping of the Black child that Verwoerd wanted reversed. Now, as an acclaimed German-trained doctor of applied psychology, Verwoerd knew that the destruction of a people must start with destroying the positive development and growth path of their children. This is something that, at least at a policy level, the leaders of our democratic state have always understood and been determined to undo. This is from the appreciation that the more we leave the current state of childhood development as it is in our country, the further we advance Verwoerd's plan and its legacy. It is for this reason that while standing in this very parliament where Verwoerd first established his destructive policy, the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, emphatically described the need to reverse the legacy of Bantu education on our children and society. And in delivering his State of the Nation address in 2018, he had this to say, and I quote, "If we are to break the cycle of poverty, we need to educate the children of the poor." Close quote. There is a clear correlation between the 40 years of deliberately depriving Black children a qualitative childhood development and the many challenges to our developmental path as a country. According to the US Center for Early Childhood Development, quantitative early childhood development provides the building blocks for educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, lifelong health, strong communities, and successful parenting of the next generation. It is therefore important that as policymakers, government departments, implementing agencies, private sector, and community-based organizations, we understand the importance of early childhood development and learn how to support our children, the families, communities, and schools in ensuring qualitative development of children during the earlier critical stage. This is not an issue that can only be limited to just education, but the overall growth and development of a child. Chairperson, it remains of serious concern, though, that the state of early childhood development education in our country is not as yet at the level to deliver on some of the developmental imperatives we've been talking about. For the majority of South African children, early childhood development remains informal or limited to preparation to start school, or even just to keep children occupied and safe while parents are at work. We're encouraged, though, by the policy initiatives that are clearly intended to redirecting the purpose of this early childhood education for the better. These, however, need to be practicalized, taking into consideration the extent of the damage that has to be addressed and the best approach to this. A proper due diligence needs to be done to ensure success in implementing and monitoring of results. Both the National Development Plan and the National Integrated Early Childhood Development Policy call for a comprehensive approach to programs for early childhood development. These must include proper regulation and setting of objectives. Clear attention should be given to issues such as curriculum, access, quality and assessment, safety and access to basic services and facilities. Parliament, and indeed all members of Parliament, are essential actors in the promotion and protection of human rights, including the rights of children. This is the imperative that forms our ongoing partnership with the United Nations Children's Fund South Africa. We believe that UNICEF's extensive network covering more than 190 countries and territories, as well as its vast experience working for the protection, education, and development of children, makes them the ideal partner from whom we can share experiences and benchmark best practices. Now, more than ever, there is a need for an integrated and holistic approach to addressing challenges facing our children, especially as many governments put in place the plans for reconstruction and economic recovery. One of the roles that Parliament has decided to play as part of its oversight is to ensure the proper monitoring of both the development and implementation of these plans. In the context of South Africa, we also want to ensure that vulnerable sectors of our society, including women and children, having borne the worst of the burden of COVID-19, are not excluded from these plans and resultant investment focus. We also need to utilize our presence in various international parliamentary forums to ensure that this important consideration is not only limited to South Africa, but the region and the world. So, Chairperson and dear colleagues, we understand that whatever work we do in the agenda of the protection and development of children, their own voices should be heard. The current process of strengthening our sector parliaments, including the Children's Parliament, will assist in creating platforms for meaningful child participation in this regard. This will ensure that when it comes to issues affecting them, children are not just passive recipients of solutions, but become active agents who are informed and able to influence decisions affecting their lives. In conclusion, Program Director, both Parliament and the UNICEF can help ensure that government's policies and plans are supported to go into implementation, including resource mobilization, and that they are monitored to impact and success. Much of the work already been done will be articulated by both the Department of Social Development and the parliamentary committees responsible for the oversight of the relevant departments when they make their presentations later on. As I've already indicated, this is too important an area of government to be allowed to fail or stagnate in any way. I wish this webinar very fruitful and incisive discussions, and that we will leave here stronger in our resolve for effectiveness than we have been for any other time. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, for your kind opening remarks. It was really very informative, and I think it sets a stage for further discussion and debate. Your participation in this webinar is therefore much appreciated. Thank you very much. We will now continue with the rest of the program. Ms. Hubrechts and I will briefly introduce the presenters from the concise biographies that we received. We will also welcome your active participation during the Q&A session. So I now wish to welcome our next presenter, Ms. Christine Muigana, who is a UNICEF rep in South Africa. She will outline the purpose of the webinar. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. May I confirm that you can hear me?
We can hear you and we can see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Speaker of the National Assembly, the Honorable Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, the Chairpersons of the Portfolio Committee on Social Development and the Select Committee on Health and Social Services, Honorable Members of Parliament, government representatives, religious leaders, and representatives from the academic and civil society organizations, colleagues and partners. A very good afternoon to you all from Pretoria. On behalf of UNICEF in South Africa, I welcome you to the first of two workshops that will focus on strengthening the national child rights governance system to enhance South Africa's inclusive rights-based development. UNICEF has had an enduring engagement with the National Parliament of South Africa, which we view as a fundamental pillar of this country's hard-won democracy. In August of 2018, Parliament and UNICEF in South Africa signed a memorandum of understanding to formalize and guide collaboration on matters related to the rights and protection of children. One of the key thrusts of the Memorandum of Understanding was to enhance the capacity of members and officials of Parliament through knowledge creation and knowledge sharing initiatives. It is concerning for all of us that despite the notable gains made since the advent of democracy, a 2020 Statistics South Africa and UNICEF study found that an estimated 60% of children in this country still do not have access to the required combinations of services, that's health, nutrition, and education, to secure their full development. The reasons for this are multifaceted and are in part due to the gaps in the national childcare and protection system. This challenging situation has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has unfortunately deepened inequalities, both in this country and globally. To address this critical issue, UNICEF has partnered with the National Parliament of South Africa to better understand how Parliament can effectively utilize its statewide legislative oversight and constituency role to increase the proportion of children to not only survive, but also thrive and grow up to their fullest potential. Over the course of this session, participants will elaborate on the situation of children, the statutory obligations of the state, and deliberate further on the role of Parliament on how to enhance the critical rights of children to nutrition, to healthcare, protection, responsive family care, education, and basic services in general. There will also be opportunity to dialogue and reflect on current strengths and weaknesses in the prevailing governance system, services, and nurturing care environment for our children. I'm pleased to see that many of our valued partners are participating in the webinar, including the Department of Social Development, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, Save the Children, Statistics South Africa, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Children's Institute, the Center for Child Law, and the South African Civil Society Coalition for Children's Rights. I conclude here by reaffirming the role of Parliament as a powerful symbol of the vibrancy and accountability that characterizes South Africa's democratic process. As we get ready to commemorate World Children's Day later this week on Saturday, on the 20th of November, and the 75th anniversary of UNICEF on the 11th of December, we very much look forward to continuing our engagement in a collective effort to further develop South Africa's human capital foundations, our children. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Muhigana, for your insightful speech and for your time and presence this morning. And thank you, Madam Speaker, for your earlier intervention this morning. What a high-level commitment to this important webinar this morning. So I have the pleasure to now introduce to you all Professor Nick Spall. He is Professor at the Department of Research and Socioeconomic Policy at the Faculty of Economics and Management Sciences at Stellenbosch University. He's going to give us a status update on the rights of children, and notably the most vulnerable ones, as to develop to their full potential and participate, and share with you the progress that has been made since the last 30 years, but also emphasize the gaps and challenges that still exist. Prof. Spall, it's an honor to welcome you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and good morning to everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and confirm that you can see this. So, good morning to everyone, Madam Speaker and honourable delegates. I'm looking forward to presenting some of the information that we have about child rights in South Africa and the outcomes of young children. I've labelled this child development in South Africa, getting from where we are to where we need to be. The first thing to emphasize is that the development of children from a very young age, and even from conception, starts with a healthy pregnancy. It starts with children having nurturing care in their home with their families, from good nutrition and good parenting towards access to early learning opportunities. You can see in this graph that there are three essential elements. The first is that the early brain development of a child sets the angle of that child's future trajectory, and both into the world of work, but also into school. The second one there shows you that skills beget skills. When children have quality early learning opportunities to develop their numeracy and early literacy skills, they thrive at school. The types of developmental outcomes that we measure, and I'm going to report on some of those at ECD, are absolutely critical to the success in school and later in life. And then lastly, once a child has had access to these opportunities in early childhood development and in school, thriving in the workplace requires kind of a navigation from the world of school to the world of work. So South Africa has a lot of information on developmental outcomes of children, and I'm going to emphasize these today because this is a short presentation. But this is just to show that in these 5 areas of primary level maternal and child health, of nutritional support, support for primary caregivers, social services and income support, and stimulation for early learning, we have a lot of information on both the progress over time as well as the challenges that we still face. To summarize this, I'm just going to highlight 5 of the headline findings from the Early Childhood Development Report that was released last year. The first one is that infant and child death rates have more than halved with the rollout of antiretroviral treatment, which is a huge success in South Africa. We have the largest antiretroviral network in the world. We provide the largest number of antiretrovirals to HIV positive individuals in the entire world. The second one is that over 90% of women attend antenatal clinics, indicating that the reach of those clinics is far and wide. This is not so much a red flag, but an orange one, that only 80% of mothers of eligible children under 5 actually get the childcare grant. And then the last 3 findings, which I will emphasize later. The first one is that more than 1 in 4 children are nutritionally stunted, which has a huge impact on their later development and on the economy. That only about half of 3 to 4-year-olds participate in any learning program, and only half of these children attend programs of sufficient quality. And we'll also touch on the subsidy for those ECD programs. And then lastly, if we look at the most foundational skill that's required for success at school, being able to read for meaning, only 1 in 4 children can actually read for meaning by grade 4. We also have the nurturing care framework, which is an incredibly helpful way of framing what children need in order to thrive in life. They need good health, they need adequate nutrition, they need responsive caregiving, as well as a safe and secure family environment and opportunities for early learning. In this presentation, I'm only going to focus on these 2, adequate nutrition and opportunities for early learning, because the other areas will be covered by other speakers. And I also have reports that I reference at the end for those that would like to read more about those. So perhaps the first question to ask is an extreme form of a lack of adequate nutrition, which is stunting. Before the pandemic, how many children were stunted in South Africa? Firstly, what is stunting? Stunting is when a child has low height for their age. They are too short for what they should be, given the age that they are, and this is usually due to malnutrition, repeated infections, and poor social stimulation. In South Africa, 1 in 4 children under 5 are stunted, 27%. Now, what this graph is showing you, the red dot is South Africa, is our gross national income per capita on the x-axis at the bottom, how wealthy we are as a country, and on the y-axis, the percentage of children under 5 that are stunted. And what you can see is that South Africa is an outlier here. We have the same rate of stunting as Kenya does, but we are actually twice as wealthy as Kenya is, if you look at the gross national income per capita. So for our level of wealth, we would expect much lower rates of stunting, which indicates this is an area that we really have to do a lot more in, given how detrimental to future outcomes it is if a child is stunted. What about hunger? How many children in South Africa go hungry in South Africa now? The first one is that the trends since 2002 are very positive, from 2002 to about 2012. The graph on the left here shows you child hunger in South Africa in the previous week using general household survey, and I'm going to also use a pandemic survey called NIDS-CRAM. And what you can see is that there was this big reduction between 2002 to about 2008 in weekly child hunger, from around 19%, 1 in 5, to about 9%, 1 in 10. And then you can see it stabilizes at that rate, although there's a small increase for the financial crisis around 2009. Why is that? Everyone recognizes that there has been one of the most successful post-apartheid policies implemented by the ANC and the government is the child support grant. This was a massive increase in targeted support for poor households that led to the significant decline in child hunger. So you can see that from about 2002, when only 2 million children received the child support grant, whereas in 2012, this had increased by 600% to 12 million children, and is now closer to about 13 million children in 2021. However, there's also been a huge increase in child hunger as a result of the pandemic. This was about 8% according to the General Household Survey in 2018, but has doubled to 15% in 2020. If we look at the pandemic survey, the National Income Dynamics Study Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, we can see in this graph here, household hunger, child hunger, and the percentage of households that reported that they ran out of money to buy food in the previous month. So you can see during hard lockdown, nearly half of South African households reported that the household ran out of money to buy food in the month of April. This declined since then, which also led to a decline in household hunger and child hunger from 15% to 12% as the lockdown eased. But you still see that in April and May of this year, 2021, 14% of households reported that a child went hungry in the last 7 days because there wasn't enough money to buy food. What that means is that 10 million people and 3 million children were living in households that were affected by hunger in April and May in 2021. And note that weekly hunger in the previous week, is an extreme form of hunger. The General Household Survey, for example, usually asks whether or not anyone in the household went hungry in the previous year, whereas during the pandemic, we needed to limit that measure to a much more acute form of hunger, given the prevalence of it. If we now move on to education and opportunities for early learning, if we start at the top and we ask how many children in South Africa pass matric and or get a degree before we go below that to what happens before school. In some ways, you can think of this as saying from creche to college, where do the wheels come off? We know that we have big challenges in education. Where is the problem starting? And I think, as you're going to see, it starts very early. If we just look at those that start school, before we look at ECD, of 100 children that start school, what we can see is that only 60 will write matric. Only 37 will pass matric. Only 12 will access university, and only 4 will complete an undergraduate degree within 6 years of completing matric. Note that this is not a sample study. This is based on following the entire matric cohort using their ID numbers into and through the entire higher education system using HEMIS. So of 100 children that are starting school, less than half are passing matric and only 4 are completing an undergraduate degree. It's very clear that there are huge problems in the schooling system, particularly at the primary school level, where 78% of grade 4 children cannot read for meaning in any language. This is one of the binding constraints to progress. From a child rights perspective, it's very encouraging that in September of this year, the South African Human Rights Commission launched at the Constitutional Court the right to read and write. This is explaining what does it mean for children to have the right to a basic education. It includes the right to be able to read for meaning and to write with understanding in your home language by the age of 10. But what about before school? It's very clear that children don't come to school on an equal footing, and that for many children, they are not primed for success. Of the 6.5 million children aged 0 to 5 years of age, how many of them access ECD programs? We can see that only 10% of them are accessing subsidized centers, 27% are accessing non-subsidized centers, 14% are accessing non-center-based programs, and half of children are not accessing any program whatsoever. So it's very clear that even in subsidized centers, where there is the 17 Rand per child per day, which is only a partial subsidy of the costs, the vast majority of children do not have access to early childhood development opportunities, and particularly quality early childhood development opportunities. A huge part of this is because of the low subsidies. Of the 6.5 million children aged 0 to 5, only 630,000 receive the partial subsidy. Whereas if we think of for primary schooling, the subsidy would essentially be everyone in a public school, which is 96% of all children in primary school. What about learning outcomes? If we look at the Early Learning Outcomes Measure, or ELOM, which tests children aged 3 to 5, what we can see is that across a number of predictive areas of achievement, gross motor development, fine motor control, emergent literacy and numeracy, executive function, all of these different elements that are in this table over here, what we can see is that in the sample, and although it is a relatively small sample and the Department of Basic Education is implementing the Early Years Index this year, actually, to test a nationally representative sample, but in this sample, we saw that 71% of children did not reach the developmental thresholds for their age between 3 and 5. So it's very clear that the wheels are not coming off in grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3. The wheels are coming off a long time for that. Now, one thing that I think a lot of people are not aware of is spending. How much money do we actually spend on basic education, on schooling, versus on early childhood development, and specifically early learning? So we're not talking about the child support grant, for example, because the child support grant is also paid out to children that are enrolled in school, in basic education. This is specifically for early learning. And what we can see is that for every 100 Rand we spend on basic education, we only spend 1 Rand on ECD. In other words, 1%. To be specific, if we look at the Treasury documents, in 2021, the budget for basic education was 255 billion Rand, whereas the budget for early childhood development was 3.5 billion Rand, or 1.3%. This has huge implications for the quality of services that it's able to offer to children, and particularly young children. At the moment, we rely on parents to pay fees, and because of that, very poor parents cannot pay high fees and cannot get quality education for their children. Until we can equalize the funding between basic education and early childhood development, we're not going to see big gains in basic education, because clearly the under-subsidization of early childhood development services is having a huge detrimental impact at this critical phase in children's lives. What are the implications of underfunding ECD? Firstly, 70% of ECD practitioners have no training or qualifications whatsoever. This is according to the ECD audit of 2013, and the new ECD audit of 2020-2021 will reveal this data when it gets released. The second one is that because of the lack of public funding, most ECD practitioners actually earn less than minimum wage. You can see here that in 2013, the average practitioner was earning less than 2,500 Rand per month. If you compare that to a foundation phase teacher at the time who was earning more than 20,000 Rand a month, the average ECD practitioner earns less than 1/10 of what a grade 1 teacher is paid. If we frame this a little bit differently, we could say the adults that are teaching our 5 and 6-year-olds are being paid 10 times as much as the adults that are teaching our 3 and 4-year-olds. This is despite the fact that we know that the development is most spicy, it's most able to apply new information and experiences at the early years, and that declines over time. So in the time when brain development is most ripe for exposure, we actually are significantly underinvesting in what we should. And this is essentially one of the implications from both of these reports, which are excellent reports, the South African Early Childhood Review of 2019, as well as a plan to achieve universal coverage by 2030, which is a sector-wide document to try and document how might we get there. In both of these, the 5 areas that we mentioned earlier are integrated with various metrics that are trying to explain where are we in terms of the child support grant or stunting, the number of children that complete immunizations. It can be a very complicated sector if we think about it, and the need for integrating all of those services for children is absolutely critical. But I think in this presentation, what I've wanted to emphasize are these 3 different things. The first one is that 1 in 4 children are stunted. Their opportunities in life are severely limited even before they enter school. The second one is that only 1 in 10 young children aged 0 to 5 are the recipients of tax-funded ECD subsidies for their learning. And even then, the subsidy of 17 Rand per child per day is obviously not enough. And the last one is around funding. For every 100 Rand that we spend on basic education, we are only spending 1 Rand and 37 cents on early childhood development opportunities. And so the question that I put both to the sector and to Parliament is the lack of funding for early childhood development the binding constraint to progress? Is it possible that more funds can be targeted towards this critical area? Of course, funds is not the only issue. We have to ensure things like efficient management information systems for ECD so that we know which services are being offered to which children. These are not only funding constraints, but it's also the ability to spend that money. But I think that it's really worth us introspecting and asking ourselves as a country, are we really serious about the development of children aged 0 to 5 if we spend 1% of what we spend on basic education? And then finally, this is some work with one of our PhD students, Poppy and Tucker, some possible avenues for strengthening Parliament relate to tracking the progress of implementations of recommendations and resolutions. For time purposes, I'm not going to go into the details, but these would be available on the slides for those that are interested. Includes our recommendations on coordination between the different committees, enhancing public participation, capacity building of those in Parliament, as well as some observations around the number of bills that do get passed, particularly on basic education. So in closing, I'd really like to thank everyone for their participation, for the time that's made available today to talk about this critical issue. And to really say that as a country, we will not be able to move beyond the development of our children, and that child development happens long before school. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Spal. This was an incredibly insightful presentation with critical statistics that we are learning from you. I took 3 main points from your presentation. One is, the limited coverage of ECD subsidized government programs and privatized as well. And then the lack of ECD funding, but also the critical statistics pertaining to stunting. So I'm kindly asking everyone to keep their questions until after the presentations of Stats SA and Children's Institute. And then we have a whole round of question and answers to all the 4 panelists from this morning. Professor Spal, it was a great honor to have you with us. And please stay until the end of this webinar. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I have then the great honor to welcome our colleagues from Stats SA. They have undertaken a multi-dimensional poverty survey last year together with Unicef. And Ms. Nosipo Shabalala, the Chief Director responsible for poverty and inequality statistics, as well as the acting DDG for population and social statistics, is on the line and ready to give us her presentation together with her colleague, Ms. Patricia Coca. And Ms. Coca is the director responsible for the production of MODA, the multidimensional poverty statistics, within the Poverty and Inequality Statistics Division at Stats SA. Over to you, partners. It's a great honor. We look forward to learning further from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Program Director. Speaker of the National Assembly, Honorable Mayor Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, Honorable Members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, all protocol observed, I greet you all. I will then now share the presentation that we are going to make today. May I confirm whether the presentation is showing on the screen?
Yes, Director, we can see your presentation and hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you. This presentation is based on the report that StatsSA worked on in collaboration with Unicef, with the technical assistance from the Social Policy Research Institute. And this report is on child poverty in South Africa. It is divided into two parts. The first part covers the background on the report and also just an overview of the poverty situation in South Africa at national level. And the second part drills into the profile of the children in South Africa, those in particular that are living in poverty. So I am going to cover the first part, and my colleague, Patricia Koka, will cover the second part of the presentation. So this report that was done by StatsSA and UNICEF, it seeks to provide insights on child poverty in South Africa using the multiple overlapping deprivation analysis methodology, which we call for short the MODA. The MODA is a methodology that is designed to specifically measure child poverty in countries, and various countries have adopted this methodology of MODA. So for South Africa, this methodology or this report, it provides information on multidimensional poverty levels in the country specific to children. And it also provides information on the main contributors to the poverty situation of children in South Africa, as well as the socioeconomic and geographic characteristics of poor children in South Africa. It is based on a survey that we conducted in 2014-15 called the Living Conditions Survey, and for short we call it the LCS. This LCS is a household-based survey conducted by Statistics South Africa to measure poverty in the country, and we visited 25,000 or over 25,000 households where we knocked on their doors, we administered questionnaires, and we asked for responses from these households. This survey collected information on detailed income and expenditure, on education, on housing, on social welfare, on health and living circumstances. I've already indicated some information about the MODA, that it's not only South Africa that has done this analysis, but other countries have also done the same analysis for their countries. So countries select dimensions and indicators that are relevant to their situation. So the South African MODA has 7 dimensions and 14 indicators. When we are talking about children, we are referring to those aged 0 to 17 years. But because children are affected differently at various ages, they are affected differently by circumstances around them. There are some indicators that are relevant to some age groups and not relevant to other age groups. So I'll just quickly go through the 2 slides that show the dimensions and the indicators and talk briefly to those. So we have a dimension, the MODA, by the way, it's an index. So this index has 7 dimensions and 14 indicators. So the dimensions, they talk to the WASH dimension, which refers to sanitation, waste disposal, and drinking water source. And all children aged 0 to 17, this dimension and these indicators are relevant to those children. And then we have a dimension on housing, which looks at shelter, looking at materials used for roof, walls, and floor, and also energy, using indicator that talks to fuel for cooking and for lighting. And these indicators and dimensions are applied across all the age groups from 0 to 17. We then also have nutrition dimension, where we use the indicator of food security. I think the previous speaker has already spoken a bit about some indicators under this that talk to hunger. We used adequacy, food adequacy scale for this, and all the children aged 0 to 17, this indicator is applicable to them. And the protection dimension that talks to safety, and the health dimension, where for children aged 0 to 17, we use the indicator of distance to healthcare center. And for those ages 0 to 4, we use the availability of road to health card. When we conducted the survey, when we administered the section to the respondents, we were asking them to show us this card, and so that we can see whether all the immunizations that are supposed to have been administered to a child have been. So this we used as an indicator for children aged 0 to 4. And then the information dimension, where we looked at access to information devices and child development for 0 to 4, where we looked at exposure to ECD for children aged 0 to 2 years, and attendance, early childhood education attendance for children aged 3 to 4 years. And the education dimension, where we looked at the indicators of school attendance, lateness in schooling, and school facilities for children aged 5 to 17. So that is the MODA, or the index for South Africa when talking about the MODA. That's the structure of the index. So now these few slides that I'm going to talk to before my colleague comes in, they just give an overall profile of the country and a high-level information on the poverty levels in the country. So the South Africa population in 2021, by July, we estimated it at 60 million, which was an increase of about 600,000 people when you compare 2020 and 2021. This is just a population structure by age, which indicates that children and youth amount to nearly 38 million in South Africa, and the median age is 28. This one talks to the matrix poverty headcounts in South Africa. And now I'm not going to spend more time on this slide. We are just showing it because we're making a reference to income poverty towards the end, after we've covered this multidimensional poverty information that comes from the MODA. So we have 3 poverty lines in the country, or let me say that we use to measure poverty nationally. It's the food poverty line, the lower bound poverty line, and the upper bound poverty line. When you look at the food poverty line, which is the threshold of absolute deprivation, which refers to the amount of money required to purchase the minimum required daily energy intake, we say, according to the survey that we conducted in 2015, about a quarter of the population was living below this poverty line, meaning that about a quarter of the population in South Africa was living in absolute deprivation. And we have the lower bound poverty line, which is the line that is tracked in, I would say it is highlighted in the NDP, and it is tracked over time. So this line, the lower bound poverty line, provides an austere threshold below which one has to choose between food and important non-food items. And the results indicated that 40% of the population in South Africa in 2015 was living below this poverty line. And we have the upper bound poverty line, which is a threshold of deprivation, below which people cannot afford the minimum food and non-food requirements. And about 55.5% of the population was living below this line. So when you attach the rand values to these lines, the food poverty line amounts to, in 2021 prices, amounts to 624 rands per person per month. And the lower bound poverty line amounts to 890 rands per person per month, and the upper bound poverty line amounts to 1,335 rands per person per month. And just as also to indicate this, another indicator where we look at the sources of income. The slide on the screen indicates that about 20% of the population in South Africa, of the households in South Africa, reported that social grants are their main source of income. So in South Africa, about 20% of the population reported social grants as their main source of income. When you break down this by province, you see that in Eastern Cape, about 38% of households reported that social grants are their main source of income, and about 13% in the Eastern Cape, their main source of income was remittances. In Western Cape, only 10% indicated that social grants was their main source of income, and 3% indicated that it was remittances. This slide on the screen, I think the previous presenter also spoke a bit about it. We're looking at vulnerability to hunger. So if we look at, I'm just going to talk to the slide that talks to vulnerability to hunger as reported by households. That is the blue line on the screen, the bottom one. So we see that in 2002, we started at 22.8% of households reporting that they are vulnerable to hunger. And we then saw a decline in the proportion of households that reported hunger. By 2019, we see that we were at 10.3%. When you look at the years 2008 to 2010, between 2008 and 2009, you will see a slight increase, which if I were to remind the audience here, we had a global economic recession, and South Africa was not immune to that. So this, what you see here, is an impact of that as well. But then what is interesting is the slide, or is the line at the top. I'll say the light blue or green line that indicates the proportion of households that receive grants. So what we are seeing here is that as the proportion of households receiving grants increase, the proportion of households reporting hunger decreases. So now we're getting to the second part of the presentation, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Ms. Koka, to take us through this part. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you, Nkosi, for the first part. I'll be taking you through the numbers, the findings of child poverty using the multiple overlapping deprivation analysis. That is the work that STATSA had partnered with UNICEF, as Nkosi had indicated. So I think in the introduction, a representative from Unicef indicated the high rate of multidimensional poverty for our children in South Africa at 62.1% nationally. And then we have different groups that we looked at this data. The reason being that the MODA adopts what is called life cycle approach, which reflects on the different needs of children at their different stages of development. So we're saying the needs of a child from 0 to 4 are different from the needs of a child aged 13 to 17 years. So we don't only have what is called the head count, that is 62.1%. You can see that the base is quite high. It's actually 60% or more of the children that are multidimensionally poor, simply put, that are deprived. So there's also another measure that comes with the MODA. It is called intensity. So the intensity, it just tells us about the average number of dimensions that are experienced by poor children, and that can also be expressed as a percentage. So the next slide will just show the numbers, the percentage of that type of measure called intensity. So we see also the base is it's consistent around 57%. So it shows here that on average, these deprived children, the multidimensionally poor children in all age groups are deprived in about 4 out of the 7 dimensions that Ms. Shabalala took us through in the beginning of the presentation. So also with the MODA comes what we call the analysis, looking at the number of deprivations that a child can experience. So in this particular graph, we see the deprivation distribution by number of simultaneous deprivation for children at national level. So in the orange, I don't know if it's orange or reddish color, we're looking at, we're talking about multiple, meaning greater than 1, that is at least 2 deprivations or more. So adding those percentages, they are about 80% plus of children in South Africa that are deprived in more than 1 dimension. So we basically saying here that multiple deprivation analysis is providing the number of dimensions that the children suffer from. So a child is not only suffering in 1, but they can suffer in multiple or several dimensions at the same time. In the next slide, so we're taking what we saw in the previous slide and we take it down further and going deeper. So here we're basically looking at the overlap analysis by dimension. So 7 dimensions have been mentioned for South African child MODA. And then here I'm just for time's sake, I'm just going to be looking at one of the 7 dimensions for us to understand how this overlap it's playing with other, looking at the nutrition dimension as well as the other dimensions. So at these steps, when you add these steps from 1.6% until 0.3%, it gives roughly 42.5%, which is 43% approximated. So what it means is that in this age group, 0 to 4 years, these children, the rate of deprivation in nutrition dimension is 43%. So this 43% is being taken down to show the overlaps that this nutrition is not happening only alone, but it has got other overlapping deprivations that are coming with. For instance, let's look at 1.6%. Here we're seeing that 1.6% of children within this age group were deprived in this particular dimension called nutrition. But as we go higher in the steps, it shows us that 4.9% of the children were deprived in nutrition plus one other dimension, meaning it could be health, it could be wash, it could be education, and so forth. And then as we go up the ladder, it shows that 9.5% of children are deprived in nutrition plus two other dimensions. And it goes on and so forth. And then this is what we call the crux of the model, because it shows that the children are they're suffering from multiple and overlapping deprivations. So this is just an example to show how this overlaps are occurring at the same time for a given deprivation happening together with other deprivations. So the report has got all the details, like taking one dimension at a time and showing and explaining in detail and thoroughly how these overlaps are taking place. So then we move to the drivers of the poverty for children in South Africa. We call them major contributors to the child poverty situation. So we also are looking at the different stages of the life cycle of the child. So when we look at the smallest ones, we call them the childhood stage from 0 to 4 years. We see that housing at 20.3%, it contributes 20.3% to the poverty situation of the children within that age group. And that is followed by 18.9%, which is in the wash. What it means there is that those ones, they are the key ones that are driving poverty for children aged 0 to 4 years in South Africa. So when we look at the upper two age groups, we see sort of a similar trend. We seeing the highest education being the highest contributor to the poverty situation for those two age groups, and followed by housing. So here it's just an overview of showing what is driving child poverty at different stages of the children's development. So from slide 13 to slide 17 is basically taking you through the demographic characteristics, the geographic location, the living circumstances, and the household characteristics of children living in multidimensional poverty. So for the sake of time, because there are about a lot of slides, there is a summary slide, slide number 34, that I would rather give you that summary because it's a beautiful summary than taking you through this whole lot of numbers. So I'm going to go now from main contributors. I'll be going through straight to slide number 31. That is showing the overlap. We talked about the overlaps between the dimensions. Now we're going to move and look at the overlaps between manimetric poverty and multidimensional poverty. I'll go straight to slide number 31. Yes, here is the relationship between manimetric and multidimensional poverty. So the data source that was used by CSSA for putting together this report, it afforded us to be able to compare the two. We were able to look at these two together and see what the relationship of these two comes out to be from the analysis. So Ms. Chabalala indicated for us that there is a lower bound poverty line that we can find in the government documents, like the NDP, which is the lower bound poverty line. So children suffering from that are living below this lower bound poverty line, the rate is 51%. And then if you see the red line crossing over to multidimensional poverty rate is 62.1%. So the data source allowed us to be able to match these two and see the rate of match between the two. So in the next page, I'll explain to you how the output of that match. So what, in a nutshell here, what we are saying is that not all monetary poor children are multidimensionally poor, and not all multidimensionally poor children are monetary poor. But what we find is that the overlap between the two, money metric and multidimensional poverty, is very high at 42%. And the children that are living in money metric poverty, it's 9%, and those that are living in multidimensional poverty only is 20.2%. And then we see that about 28.8% of these children, they are neither non-poor based on money metric and multidimensional poverty. So ideally, we would like to see a situation for the children of South Africa having an overlap between these two measures being very low. But looking at this data source, we see that the overlap between these two measures, monetary poverty and multidimensional poverty, being very high, at about 4 out of every 10th child being poor in both measures. So this is the slide 34 that I had indicated that I'll take you through based on all the analysis based on the demography, the geography, the living circumstances, as well as the characteristics of households which these children form part of. So we are saying from the report, we are seeing that higher rates of poverty are found among households with many members. So we are seeing high multidimensional poverty rates in households with many children, with households that have adults with no employment. We see it also where households, the household heads has no or low levels of education. So we see also that Black children are more likely to be in poverty than other population groups. And we're also looking at the orphanhood status. We see that children that are single orphans, where only a mother is alive, have higher poverty rates compared to single orphans, where only a father is alive. And then we also see that double orphans, those children that don't have either a mother nor a dad, as compared to other children, they have been revealing high multidimensional poverty rates. And we also found out that for the age group 0 to 4 years, the poverty rates were higher where those children's births were not registered, meaning those children that did not have a birth certificate. And then we also seeing that children are not only multidimensionally poor, but also have overlapping deprivations. This will, if you remember the nutrition steps that I showed you, is that they're not only deprived in nutrition, but it's nutrition, but some other dimensions as well. And then also from the report, we are seeing that there is a higher overlap rate between the monetary poverty and the multidimensional poverty, which was standing at 42%. I thank you.
Thank you so much, both directors, for stuff to say. It was an incredible insight to learn from you, Ms. Shabalala and Ms. Koka, on the multidimensional poverty children face, not only monetary, but also that 67% of children still suffer from 4 out of 7 different deprivations. We also saw the high level of dependency on the grants and low investments in the necessary job generation, which is also coming into the chat. So please, let's move forward as we are starting to run out of time, but we are embracing the content. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Laurie Lake. She's our communication and education specialist at the Children's Institute at the University of Cape Town, where she plays a central role in the production of the annual Child Gauge and convenes the Institute's child rights courses for health and allied professionals. Laurie's bio has been shared, as have the bios of the other speakers. So without further ado, we wish to move forward with Ms. Lake's presentation. Laurie, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Micah. I don't seem to be able to share my screen at the moment, so I'm just hoping someone can enable screen sharing, just so that I can share some of the findings of our work, and in particular, our work that is focused on nutrition. So I'm just trying to find my many windows that I have open. There, can you see my screen?
Yes, we see the presentation. Please go ahead.
Brilliant, that's fantastic. So it gives me great pleasure, and it's a huge honor to be sharing the work of the Children's Institute with members of Parliament, who we know are potentially really powerful advocates and champions for children's rights in South Africa. And in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing findings from our Children Count project, the South African Child Gauge, and a series of advocacy briefs that were tracking the impact of COVID-19 on South Africa's children. So we know that South African children are disproportionately concentrated in poor households. And as a result, they are likely to see their access to services and to water, sanitation, access to healthcare, all these services are compromised, as is their health and education. And for this reason, we have been running the Children Count project, tracking progress towards the realization of children's rights since 2002. And what we do is we provide a child-centered analysis of national data in order to make children visible. And then we also disaggregate that data by province, by age, by sex, by race, by geographic location, so rural, urban, and by income, in order to make visible inequalities and to help government better target policies, programs, and services for children. And in addition, we provide expert commentary to give readers a very clear sense of what these numbers actually mean for children. The South African Child Gauge is a book published by the Institute every year. And what it does is it allows us to do a much deeper dive, or provide a much deeper analysis of the situation of children in South Africa. We draw on both quantitative and qualitative studies in order to understand the challenges facing South Africa's children, but also to identify opportunities for intervention. And each year we focus in on a particular dimension of child well-being, for example, health, education, and in 2020 we focused attention on children's food and nutrition security. And then in 2020, we started work on a series of advocacy briefs, tracking the impact of the pandemic on both children and children's access to services, with the intention, again, of identifying opportunities to strengthen systems, to improve outcomes, and to better support children, both in future waves of COVID-19, but also in other crises. And there we drew on administrative data from the Western Cape, because even in what is a relatively well-resourced province, children were overlooked and left behind. So drawing on these three data sources, what do we know about child nutrition in South Africa? From the General Household Survey, we are able to track child hunger. And what we've seen is a very dramatic decrease in child hunger from a high of 36% back in 2002 down to 11% of children in 2018. So that's 1 in 10 children in South Africa living in households where children went hungry either sometimes, often, or always. And yet we know that child hunger tends to be a subjective measure, and it says nothing about the quality of food that children have access to. So easing children's hunger pains is not enough to necessarily improve their nutritional status. What we also know is that 1 in 3 children in South Africa continue to live below the food poverty line. So that's 624 Rand per person per month, which is equivalent to 21 Rand per day. And there is very, very little that you can buy with that 21 Rand. And the intent of the food poverty line is to provide just enough money to meet the basic energy requirements, daily energy requirements of an individual. It doesn't include any money to cover the costs, other costs of raising a child, such as transport, school uniforms, rent, electricity. So as households attempt to meet those other essential needs, they are forced to further compromise children's access to nutrition. So it's not surprising that 1 in 4 young children are stunted or short for age. And we know that stunting is a sign of chronic malnutrition. It speaks to children who are not getting sufficient nutrients to meet the needs for both physical growth and cognitive development. So stunting is stunting children's physical height, it's stunting their developing brains in ways that compromise learning and then later in life their employment prospects. And then at the same time, we're looking at 1 in 8 young children in South Africa who are overweight and obese, and that is double the global average, and we see overweight and obesity increasing rapidly across the life course, particularly affecting girls. So it affects 27% of adolescent girls, 68% of adult women. And this is what's fueling a growing epidemic, really, of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and heart disease in adulthood. So what came through very strongly in our work on the South African child gauge is that we need to be disrupting what we call the slow violence of malnutrition. And in a sense, malnutrition is eating away at children's potential very slowly, very gradually out of sight. And we only really recognize that there is a problem once the harm has been done. And this violence of delayed destruction is therefore very often not regarded as violence at all. And yet it is eroding the foundation for health, lifelong health, and education, and it's helping to drive this intergenerational cycle we see of ill health and poverty. It's almost like poverty is written into the body in ways that limit people's potential, and if we are concerned in any way at investing in our children's health and development and economic development, we need to start early in childhood. And then we also know that malnutrition kills children. And so roughly 50%, 1 in 2 child hospital deaths in South Africa were associated with either moderate or severe acute malnutrition. We know that COVID-19 had a profound impact on South African society. We saw inequalities widen, we saw poverty deepen. Food prices increased by 12.6% from March 2020 to 2021. This was coupled by rising unemployment, with unemployment at an all-time high of 34.4% at the end of the second quarter this year, and in fact even higher at 44.4% if we include discouraged work seekers. And we know that women were far more likely to have lost their jobs during COVID than men. Yet they are the ones who carry by far the largest burden of childcare. At the same time, we saw the closure of schools and ECD programs that denied children access to a daily meal. And therefore, it's not surprising that we saw that rise in child hunger that Nick Spall talked about earlier, affecting children in one of every 7 households in South Africa. And at the same time, we also saw how COVID-19 diverted resources from pediatrics and child health to adult COVID care in ways that has made it much harder for us to identify and support those children who are at risk of acute malnutrition. We're also worried about how increasing poverty has affected household food choices. So families, as money gets tight, tend to focus on the very basics. So families buying starch every day, knowing that that's not the healthy choice, but having no other option if they are to survive. And what this means is that children are being fed empty calories instead of diets rich in diversity and nutrients, which are what are essential to promote optimal growth and development and to prevent stunting. So we're concerned, I guess, with COVID that we're not only going to see a rise in hunger, but also a rise in stunting, in micronutrient deficiencies, and ultimately also in overweight and obesity. We also know the government has put in place a social assistance program, the Child Support Grant, which is designed to give effect to children's right to social assistance and to support and meet particularly the nutritional needs of children when parents are unable to do so. We know that the grant is associated with significant gains, a decrease in child poverty, a decrease in child hunger. But the grant amount is simply not enough to meet the nutritional needs of the child. You can see that it falls way below the food poverty line. So as much as it's taken the edge off hunger for 13 million children and their caregivers, it's failed to make any dent in childhood stunting, which has remained stubbornly unchanged for the last 20 years. And that is a huge impediment if we are attempting to move the South African economy forward. So if we are intent on building a strong foundation for children, for education, for health, and for our economy, then we need to be increasing the value of the child support grant to at least the food poverty line. Instead, what we saw in April 2021 was a below food price inflation increase of only 10 Rand to the child support grant. And as you can see from the medium-term budget projections, we are expecting that the real value of the child support grant will be further eroded as we move forward. And this is simply unacceptable. No child should experience the hunger or the slow violence of malnutrition. And we know that the state has an immediate obligation to respect, promote, protect, and fulfill children's right to basic nutrition. It is not subject to progressive realization or to available resources. It must be prioritized. And even in an economic crisis, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has indicated that states may only introduce regressive measures as a very last resort, having considered all other possible options and ensuring that children are the last to be affected. So many of the things we need can wait, but the child cannot. Now is the time his bones are formed, her mind is developed. To him, we cannot say tomorrow. His name is today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Your message is loud and clear. The level of chronic malnutrition and child hunger that is being experienced is at such level of in need of dire attention with urgency. As we can't miss, 1/4 of the population due to a lack of proper nutrition. and food security. And also your advocacy is well noted on the level of the child support grants up to the level of the food poverty line at the minimum. So please pay attention to the website of Children's Institute to access the data of the annual child gauge. It's a core set of data and indicators pertaining to the whole situation of children that is being issued every year. And this year, there is a child gauge coming out on the issue of mental health, and Laurie indicated the link to the one on child nutrition that was launched at the later last year. So thank you very much, Laurie. Job well done. Thank you to all the speakers. In the interest of time, I would appreciate if you would accept us to respond to your questions in the chat one by one, so that by the end of the webinar, you will have received answers, but I would like to skip the 10 minutes of questions and answers so that I can introduce David Chabalala, the Chief Director of the Office of the Rights of the Child in the Department of Social Development. So we move to the next session in order to understand how DSD responding to the situation of children with the constitutional obligations, the treaty obligations, and if there is time at the end, we can still find time to answer further questions, but for now we will start responding to these in the chat. Thank you so much, Laurie, Zipo, and Patricia. It was wonderful to hear your presentation. Over to you, Mr. Chabalala. Mr. Chabalala, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, ma'am.
Okay, great.
I just want to confirm if my picture, can you see my picture?
We cannot yet see your picture, but we hear you loud and clear. Mr. Chabalala, the Acting Chief Director on the Office of the Rights of the Child from DSD, has a postgraduate in development studies with Unicef. And before joining government, he was involved in the trade union movement as a worker representative and organizer for NUMSA and involved in different COSATU structures. And we are happy to welcome you, Mr. Chabalala. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just disappointed that my camera is not working. I don't know, but in any event, I will proceed. I want to send special greetings to Madam Speaker, Me Nosiwe Mapisa Ngakula, the Honorable Chairperson of the NCOP, Mr. Amos Masondo, Honorable Members, Unicef County Rep, Ms. Christine Muhigana. Allow me to just indicate that all protocols observed. Let me start by indicating, Madam Speaker, that many decades prior to the establishment of a democratic government in 1994, in our country, the rights and welfare of children were informed by the apartheid system, policies that were characterized by racial discrimination and segregation. Social and economic services were divided and graded along racial lines, with Black communities, families, and their children provided with none or very poor services, resulting in generations that were and still are trapped in poverty, unemployment, and low educational standards. The rights of children are protected in our Constitution, as we all know, and since 1994, we have instituted a range of legislative, policy, and regulatory instruments to advance and promote these rights. But of course, despite our significant developmental gains as a nation since the advent of democracy, widespread poverty and inequality persists and continues particularly dire effect on children's lives, education, and protect the rights of children in South Africa dates back to intense political struggles that were aimed at eradicating the apartheid system and replace it with freedom and equal human rights for all. That, of course, is inclusive of children. The intense conflict against the apartheid system was demonstrated by the uprising back then in 1976. This was led by children against racial discrimination repression. And I just want to share what had happened in 1987, where a conference that was titled Children, Repression and the Law in Apartheid South Africa. This conference was convened in Zimbabwe to address the issues of children in South Africa. And I just want to quote the late president of the African National Congress, Ndate Oliver Tambo. I open close. We cannot be true liberators unless the liberation we will achieve guarantees all children their rights to life, health, happiness, and free development, respecting the individuality, inclinations, and capabilities of each child. Our liberation will be untrue to itself if it did not, among its first tasks, attend to the welfare of the millions of children whose lives have been stunted and turned into a terrible misery by the violence of the apartheid system. I close quote. Further than that, Section 28 of the Constitution stipulates that a child's best interests are paramount importance in all matters concerning the child. And in South Africa, we all know that we've got the Children's Act number 38 of 2005 that makes provision for the best interest of the child in all matters that concern a child and outlines implementation guidance in this regard. As a result, this principle applies throughout all sectors and is enforceable by law. And I also want to just share with everybody that the participation of children in matters that affect them should not only be an event, but the starting point of meaningful and respectful engagement between children and adults on the development of policies, programs, and measures in all relevant contexts of children's lives. Child participation anchors the contribution of the child rights sector to sustainable transformation and social cohesion. It is through focused child participation facilitated by relevant stakeholders that children as future adults are enabled to responsibly embrace and internalize the principle of human rights, child rights, and related obligations. When this is achieved, children are likely in the long term to take this understanding into adult and parenthood. This process in turn contributes to the sustainable transformation in society. Furthermore, social cohesion is promoted when children from different races, gender, or social classes participate on the same platforms on matters that connect rather than separate them. This principle of child participation is directly or indirectly enshrined in Section 59 and Section 72, and further Section 118 of the Constitution and Chapter 15 of the National Development Plan. In South Africa, children are involved in both government and civil society at provincial, national, and regional and international levels in processes that address a diversity of issues that impact on their lives. I just want to share with everybody that the annual provincial and national children's parliament is an important example. We're in the process of institutionalizing this platform in ensuring that the voices of children are heard and taken seriously by decision makers and the society at large. And of course, I must say this institutionalization, we are working with Parliament, and thank you very much for this platform. And in the process, we are making sure that we ensure that children with disabilities and those children that are from the rural areas are also included in this process. I also want to share that South Africa has developed and implemented 3 national plans of action for children since the ratification of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1995. The first National Plan of Action for Children, in brief, we call it NPAC, was developed during 1996. It was followed by the second one during 2000 and the third in 2012. We are having the fourth one that has just been approved by Cabinet last year, which runs with this present MTSF cycle 2019 to 2024. And this NPAC looks at achievements during the period of implementation, and it establishes a baseline for target setting in the following NPAC. By ensuring continuous improvements and progression in the implementation of children's rights. Therefore, each NPAC process must take into cognizance achievement made, like I've indicated. Central to the delivery of, against the delivery of the NPAC is the requirement for a functional, effective, and efficient institutional mechanism for the coordination of these NPAC goals and objectives. I just want to emphasize the importance of oversight mechanisms, which includes, among other important platforms, the National Children's Rights Intersectoral Coordinating Committee, the Office on the Rights of the Child, which is presently located in the Department of Social Development, and of course, departmental children's rights focal points or persons. Municipal and provincial office on the rights of the child are very important. We know for a fact that we are struggling now. I mean, these focal persons are doing more than one responsibility. On top of children, they're also dealing with women, disability, moral regeneration, and many other things. So we are very mindful of the fact that although there's been significant progress and achievement made in addressing the rights of children in South Africa, ongoing challenges remain, which require interventions and concerted efforts to further improve the response to promoting the rights and needs of children and to achieve the 7 priorities established by government. And of course, access to services for children, in particular Black children in the apartheid era, were poor, inconsistent, or not available. Building a comprehensive system with a developmental orientation that served all children in South Africa, not only for a privileged minority, required massive scaling up of support and services, as well as significant legislative and programmatic innovations and system building interventions. The challenges have been even more complex due to the growing size, mobility, and social and economic circumstances of the child population. Despite the complexity of the task at hand, the extensive policy innovations and legislative reform of the past 2 decades have contributed immensely to improvements in the levels of children, notably in their standard of living, reductions in poverty, and of course, declining child mortality rate. Maybe let me conclude by talking to the treaty obligations. South Africa ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1995 and followed by the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child in 2000. Based on these ratifications, the country is obliged to submit periodic reports to the UN in terms of Article 44 and then in terms of Article 43 of the African Charter. Following the above important undertaking, the Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child adopted Africa Agenda for Children, which is titled the Agenda 2040 for Children. This agenda is aimed at fostering an Africa fit for children, and it's anchored in the view that by nurturing and nourishing the current generation of Africa's children. The country's second periodic report to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child was presented in November 2014. The concluding observations from the committee were received in 2016. Furthermore, the list of issues towards submission of the country's combined 3 to 6 periodic reports were issued in February this year. The due date for the next report to the UN has been extended to June 2020. This report will provide responses to the list of issues raised by the committee and will cover the reporting period from 2016 to 2021. The drafting of this report will be finalized by the end of this year and will be processed to the clusters and cabinet for approval. South Africa also presented its initial report to the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child on the implementation of this charter. The first one, I think it was the initial report was in 2014. The second country report on progress made on the implementation of policy and legislation relating to this charter was approved by Cabinet in December 2016. The report was subsequently presented to the committee in November 2018. Feedback from the committee in the form of concluding observations was issued by the committee in March 2019. The next periodic report to the committee is due in March, meaning next year, 2022. And the report outlines progress made in implementation of the articles enshrined in the Charter. I just want to also share the fact that we also have a number of optional protocols. One of those is the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And as South Africa, we are in the process of signing the optional protocol on the communications procedure. And one can ask a question as to what needs to be done moving forward. What are the systematic actions envisaged to strengthen child rights delivery or governance in South Africa? There are three things that I've picked up here. The first one is that of coordinated efforts in the implementation of the National Plan of Action for Children, which was approved by Cabinet in October last year. Coordination of this is very much important. Second one is strengthening institutional mechanisms such as ensuring that the coordination and oversight is exercised from executive authority level, such as the presidency, premiers, and mayor's offices. And the last one is that of ensuring the mainstreaming of children's rights at all levels. In terms of implementation of children's rights imperatives, including the constitutional obligations, plans are underway towards a child rights governance engagement, which ideally will include Parliament. This will be preceded by, and of course, we've already started, sector-specific consultations that are aimed at soliciting input on the envisaged outcome document. And this outcome document will be outlining the commitment by different sectors, and it will be adopted at that high-level engagement. And we are also looking forward to celebrating the 32nd anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which annually happens on the 20th of November. And this time around, we are proposing to have it on the 26th of November because we don't want to interrupt the school calendar, because our learners are also important in being part of that process. So they are still busy with examinations. I just want to thank you very much for this opportunity, and we're looking forward towards continued engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shobalala, for that very insightful presentation. We're now moving to Parliament's role in child development and challenges in that regard. Our next presenter is the chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Social Development, Honorable Mbana, who will give a presentation on Parliament's role to date and how it can strengthen the responses. As you perhaps note, we are trying to keep up with the time slots of the program. So without further delay, I now hand over to Honorable Mbana. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon to Program Director, Speaker of NA, NCOP Chairperson, and all panelists. I wish to greet again. Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the Parliament's key role in raising and realizing children's rights. I would like to start by saying the best interest of the child is paramount to every matter concerning the child. Program Director, the rights of the children are highly defined in international human rights treaties, such as United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, regional human rights treaties, such as African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and country-specific legislation. South Africa is a signatory to the above mentioned instrument, and thus find expression in domestic legislation and policies that provide to child's rights. The CRC transformation or transform children from being passive objects to active rights holders. This simply, Chairperson, means that the convention recognizes that children have their views, interest, and concern that should be heard.
Children are today's citizen, Chair, can act as leaders now and in the future. And they are tomorrow's decisions. However, the reality on the ground is that through the convention was ratified by most states, including South Africa, a number of their child rights are not yet fully realized, Chair. For an example, children in South Africa are still faced with challenges such as poverty, abuse, lack of birth registration, and lack of access to early childhood development. Children living with disability, Chairperson, are the worst affected children. During the public hearings on the amendment bill, which are still on, in the committee, issues such as lack to access to special and disability grants. Children in the rural areas are still experiencing challenges of birth registration and limited access to early childhood development centers. I think I'm repeating that one, Chairperson, because I wanted to emphasize on it. Houses of Parliament, that is the NCOP and NA, as well as their committees and other structures, have an important role in monitoring the implementation of child's rights position. From the country's laws, enhance oversight for legislation, approval of plans and budgets, and as well as monitoring the implementation of various programs is key to the accelerated realization of child's rights. The rights of children are an undisputedly integral and unfavorable component, Chair, in all areas of parliamentary work, Chairperson. The committee is also required to facilitate public participation, monitoring and oversight over the legislative processes relating to children, and also to confer with relevant governmental and civil society organs or social development matters of children. The committee urged for more research on the contributions of indigenous practices and the role played by communities, traditional leaders, and churches in protecting children and promoting their rights. Budget, Chairperson. The national budget is the responsibility of the government, but in most cases and in most countries, including South Africa, it is most be approved by the Parliament. The Money Bills Amendment Procedure and Related Matters Act gives Parliament the powers to amend the budget and other bills before it. Section 5 of the Act sets and the procedure that the National Assembly through its committees must follow it or in order to amend the national budget. This means, Chairperson, that each which must assess a department services delivery performance, given available resources and its effective and efficient use and forward allocation of available resources in BRRRs may include a recommendation on the forward or use of resources in preparation to a main budget tabled in the Parliament. That will be February, or that is used to be in February, here for BRRR reports are submitted to the Minister of Finance and relevant minister responsible to the portfolio departments to consider before main budget is tabled in the Parliament. For an example, the past recommendations to social development BRRR reports include recommendations that speaks to the services to children. COVID-19, how COVID-19 affected children or children's rights. Since the onset of COVID-19, Chairperson, the world was seen as increase in children's who have been left hungry, isolated, abused, and anxious. The education of millions of children has been disrupted. Access to social assistance has been severely impacted. In addition, the pandemic has seen a rise in depression and other mental health concern among young people in this regard. The committee had a several occasion invited the department in South Africa for SASSA and the National Development Agency to present on measures taken in ensuring that children have access to social assistance and are in receipt of social relief of distress during the lockdown. The schools were closed, as we all know. As a result, children were no longer benefiting from the school's nutrition program. The committee was also concerned that these children are no longer benefiting from the program and invited the DSD to present its plans addressing issue of food security for children whilst the schools were closed. Chairperson, let me get straight to the legislation. The committees of the Parliament should consider children's rights during the development of legislation and the implementation thereof. And I don't want to repeat that, but I would like to emphasize that to implement the rights guaranteed by the CRC implies that legislative reform is one of the most effective entry points and strategies to advance children's rights. It also suggests that legislative reforms alone is not enough, and it should be combined with efforts to implement the new laws. The Parliament should ensure the full implementation of laws. One way will be to raise law awareness by developing campaigns, targeting children, targeting their parents, targeting schools, and even judges and lawyers. In terms of the oversight, Chairperson, committees and individual members of Parliament should ensure that the executive provide prevention and early intervention programs to children who have been abused, maltreated, or neglected, and are at risk. Matters related to children's rights are not the sole prerogative of traditional committees focusing on social welfare matters such as health, education, social security, but fall beyond the scope given the duty bearer responsibility bestowed on Parliament. Conferral committees in this regard is very important. Budgeting, Chair. Child responsive budgeting from a child's rights perspective should be applied to departments during in-year monitoring of quarterly reports and the budget review, that is the BTPR, as I have said, where relevant. International agreements, Chair. In the consideration of the international arrangements and regional instrument for ratification, as well as the oversight of the state in terms of its reporting duties, the legislative has a very crucial oversight role in terms of addressing and overseeing the implementation of treaties, conventions, etc. This entails assessing the extent to which, for example, the convention has been given effect to true domestication, as well as monitoring and assessing compliance with South Africa's reporting obligations. Lastly, the representation in terms of the public participation of children must be ensured on public participation platform provided for Parliament. Mechanism and systems need to be in place to ensure that children are not excluded from public participation platforms and instead provided opportunities to meaningful participation. In conclusion, Chairperson, children's participation in policy-making law, reform and budgeting fulfills their rights. It will lead to more effective policies, laws, and programs, and will improve service delivery to children. Participation in governance also contributes to children's development as active members of society and deepens their understanding and experience of democracy. However, Chair, there are not sufficient opportunities for children to participate meaningfully in governance. The challenges for engagement include the attitudes of decision makers towards children and the time and resources needed to build the capacity of children and adults to engage meaningfully. I would like to close by saying, your child is my child, and it takes millions to raise a child. I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. I think your presentation was very informative and gave us much food for thought. We also appreciate your time and your busy schedule to attend this webinar. So thank you very, very much. I now hand over to Unicef to introduce Ms. Martins. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Mfana. Thank you very much, Dr. Wessel. It's our pleasure to introduce Patricia Martins. She is a child rights governance specialist for over 20 years, as well as a trained lawyer, very experienced and committed to the socioeconomic realization of rights. And Ms. Martins is going to facilitate a dialogue with all of you to discuss the role of Parliament after we just received a very beautiful insight by the previous chairperson of the Portfolio Committee. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ms. Martins.
Thank you very much, Micah, and to the rest of the speakers, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to facilitate the session. If you'll allow me, I think it will be just important for me to contextualize the session by just drawing together some of the common trends and themes that have come out through our discussions this morning or this afternoon, because these really, I think, point us to a number of very specific questions that I think might be helpful to pose as a way of facilitating this closing, sort of semi-closing session around the role of Parliament to address what has been a set of very disheartening figures, statistics, and facts that have been presented to us. So what I would like to just start by saying is to pick up on the point raised by the Honourable Chairperson in the last presentation around the issue of children's rights, and just to emphasise that we've heard a lot about rights and a lot of statistics around the realisation of rights or the failure to realise rights. And in the ratification of our treaties, we don't necessarily commit to realise rights per se. What we do is commit to ensure that every child not just survives, but develops, is protected, and participates so that they can fulfill their potential. And rights, therefore, are not an end in themselves. They are, in fact, the road to development. And this is what we as a country need to be keeping our eye on. And what we need to try and avoid as a country is to get focused on the issues around specific rights and then lose sight of the big issue around development. Development really is the issue at hand here. The Honourable Speaker spoke so eloquently at the beginning about the focused and deliberate social experiment that was apartheid, which deliberately sought to erode the foundations of our development, and we need to rebuild those foundations. The protracted and slow violence, as Laurie spoke about, of the failure to realise those rights has a very significant implication. The World Bank's latest Human Capital Index, which basically is an index that measures our human capital potential, for 2021 found that South Africa is going to, every child will fall short by 52% of their full potential. Every child will only develop to 48% of their potential. And the reason for this is that we are not realizing the rights that are critically essential to their full development. And the question for us then is, how do we turn that enormous boat around? And while the facts are disheartening, what is very heartening is that South Africa is a very robust and maturing democracy that has recognized these challenges and made significant policy commitments, as mentioned by Mr. Chabalala, in the National Plan of Action for Children, the National Child Care and Protection Policy, the ECD policy, to in fact invest in the development of our children, and to do so specifically to build sustainable, inclusive human capital. Given Parliament's central role in our constitutional democracy, the question for us then is, as a central role play in our constitutional democracy, what role can and should Parliament play in moving those policy commitments into real change, so that we can see a significant reduction in the proportion of children who fail to develop to their full potential? We need to start having our eye on that data, on that statistic. To realize that, they need enabling, nurturing care, which is a combination of services and support, not just one or the other, and it's across their life cycle, although the early years are critically important. To achieve this requires a multi-sectoral, coherent, systematic approach, which places children's development at the top as a national development priority, which enjoys the highest level of political leadership, oversight, and accountability. And the question is, how can Parliament, as a guiding leader of our national democratic system, guide us in placing children at the center of our national system? How can Parliament support us to ensure as a country that we move towards this goal as a country and see a significant reduction in the proportion of children at risk of poor development? How can it support national coherence and accountability? And how can it galvanize us around this common shared outcome that we need to move towards? How can we measure progress of this outcome? not just the inputs and not just the individual rights, but how can we start measuring as Parliament and using that information to strengthen our country's governance and responses to systematically address the impediments to realizing the full package of rights. And that is across the legislative, the oversight and the constituency work functions of Parliament. So we know that it is a multi-sectoral initiative, and the questions I think that we want to ask and ask you to contemplate and respond to is, given the current structure, the role, the functions of Parliament, we've heard of Parliament's role, but how can it maximize that role? How can we build the capacity? How can we build the leadership? How can we build the capacity then to fulfill or to ensure implementation of this transformational agenda? What information do parliamentarians need? We've heard a lot of statistics, and I'm wondering for how many parliamentarians this was the first time they've heard the statistics. But critically, hear the statistics and the information in a way that informs the dialogue, the public dialogue. How can Parliament provide much needed leadership to really position children's development as a national development priority, to be monitored, overseen and advanced, not just by the Portfolio Committee on Social Development, but by the Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry, Environment, Labour, and so on, and not just in the National Assembly, but the National Council of Provinces as well. What technical support would be required, for example, to start bringing about an understanding by the Trade and Industry Portfolio Committee on the impact that their decisions have on children's development? We talk about child rights budgeting. It's a treaty commitment that we have, but do we really understand what is meant by child rights budgeting? There's a huge amount of information that has come about. There's this theory, a science called childonomics, which seeks to sort of understand our budget through a child development lens rather than a child rights lens per se. Would it be beneficial to in fact enrich our dialogues around the budgets by bringing forward the dialogue and the debate within this context? In terms of Parliament itself, does Parliament itself need to look at its own institutional arrangements? How is Parliament to provide the leadership and the coordination of siloed portfolio committees, many of whom think children are not an issue for them at all, or children's development something that they have any control over? How then should Parliament perhaps look at restructuring or innovating its institutional arrangements to provide the levels of leadership and coordination necessary to support this national child rights governance system, which is necessary to implement a coherent multi-sectoral policy? And Parliament's own strategic plan, for example, does Parliament's own strategic plan, which guides all parliamentary activities, does it place children's development at the center of its work? So I think in brief, and I apologize for the slightly lengthy summary, but I think it was important to paint that context, to ask these questions of us as a group, to say, how can Parliament and how can we support Parliament to really maximize its role in our collective commitment to strengthen the system of national child rights governance, to really bring about a reduction in the proportion of children at risk of poor development, and build the human capital that we need, that is necessary to sustain the routine realization of rights going forward. So the questions are quite broad, and I'm not sure if we have time, and I look to the co-chairs to provide guidance on how we will take input on this. Mr. Wesso and Ms. Hebrecht, could you perhaps provide some guidance on what will be the best way forward in terms of facilitating and receiving inputs?
Yes, dear Patricia, it would be great to open the floor now for all to, based on your introduction, to deliberate on the role of Parliament. And then Dr. Wessel, perhaps you can indicate to us when Honourable Chairperson would need to speak, looking at the time that we are behind time. So I would suggest, Patricia, 5 minutes for discussion and 10 minutes for closure, so that we start the dialogue going, recognizing there will be need for further dialogue around the role of Parliament in a strengthened child rights governance system. Thank you.
Thank you. So the questions I pose, perhaps those would be the questions that we can open the dialogue around in terms of how can we maximize Parliament's role. And perhaps the place to start would be to look at the leadership and coordination and the institutional arrangement and structures and innovations that might be required within Parliament to maximize its role to drive, oversee, and ensure the adequate resourcing of a coherent multi-sectoral child rights national agenda. So can I open the floor to any comments, any questions? Unfortunately, I can't see any hands. So chairs, if I could just ask you to alert us to whoever has their hand raised to speak.
Any questions, colleagues? Just raise your hand, please.
I mean, maybe a suggestion is, what strikes me as really, really important is that we always, we have a very clear indicator for measuring reductions in unemployment rates. We have a quarterly statistical report that is shared by Stats SA on how well we are doing on reducing unemployment, but we do not have a similar mechanism for reducing the proportion of children at risk of poor development. And something like the MODIS study and the NIDS-CRAM studies, for example, do start providing us with some kind of insight into that, as does the World Bank's Human Capital Index. Is this something that we should be looking at institutionalizing, and is it something that Parliament could perhaps look at driving? And then the other question is, how do we bring our different portfolio committees together, galvanize them, and get them really to understand what is required for children's development across the full spectrum of role players, and how to action that in terms of child rights governance? So maybe those two questions might be more direct. And if there are any responses to that, it would be most welcome.
Questions? I think what we can also do, as Hubert, if there are any questions coming in, we can always feed it to the presenters at a later stage. So maybe we can go, if there's no questions at this stage, we can always feed it through at a later stage, if you don't mind, Ms. Martin, to take up some of those questions.
Absolutely fine. I'm very happy to do that.
Over to you, Dr. Wessel.
Okay, thanks very much, Ms. Martin, for picking up on the important points discussed and your insight around it. I think the questions around Parliament's role in developing children to their full potential are very pertinent, especially, the political leadership required and guidance in this regard. And how do we measure progress to strengthen governance in Parliament? I think those are very pertinent questions. And if there's any comments or questions around any of the issues that you've raised, we will certainly feed them through to you, and then you can provide some answers. So, ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce the chairperson of the NCOP, Honorable Amos Masondo, who will provide us with some closing remarks. We do realize the busy programs of senior politicians at Parliament, and we are therefore particularly honored to have Madam Speaker earlier on, and now the Honorable Chairperson of the NCOP to give us some closing remarks. So, Honorable Masondo, we're looking forward to your closing remarks, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and greetings to everyone. Good afternoon. Program Director, Honorable Speaker of the National Assembly, Unicef, Country Representative, Ms. Christine Muhigana, Honorable Members of Parliament, representatives of government and non-governmental organizations, ladies and gentlemen. Program Director, allow me to begin by thanking the organizers for the invitation to join today's webinar on the role of Parliament in building the country's human capital foundations, and for the opportunity to make the closing remarks. This was first multi-sectoral engagement in the 6th Parliament that is focusing on the rights and protection of children. It comes at a time when we face serious challenges in respect of promoting and protecting the rights and interests of children. As we speak, research shows that at least 21% of children aged 17 years and under do not live with their parents. At least 62% of children are identified as multidimensionally poor. More than half of South Africa's children continue to live below the poverty line. And 30% of children live in households where no adults are employed and have little or no access to a daily healthy diet. Program Director, in light of this, I wish to commend the 5th Parliament for its foresight in establishing the strategic collaboration between Parliament and Unicef, which culminated in the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between the two institutions in the year 2018. Of course, the role of Unicef in supporting capacity building initiatives for members and officials of Parliament predates this important milestone. Both the 5th and 6th Parliament have placed a high premium on ensuring empowered members for effective and efficient functioning of Parliament. This is achievable, among other means, through the capacitation of members and officials and the improvement of the overall support system. It is thus commendable that our Knowledge and Information Services Division is emerging as part of the vanguard for the implementation of Parliament's knowledge management strategy. These strategic collaborations and knowledge sharing initiatives gives life to our knowledge management strategy. They are critical to enhancing parliamentary oversight and deeper scrutiny. Given its lawmaking, oversight, and representative functions, Parliament has a great role to play in promoting and protecting the rights and interests of children. Our Constitution Program Director provides a clear guidance in how we must assist the children. Among other things, it provides that we must guarantee their right to basic nutrition, shelter, basic health care services, and social services. To be protected from maltreatment, neglect, abuse, or degradation. To be protected from exploitative labor practices. Not to be required or permitted to perform work or provide services that are inappropriate for a person of that child's age, or place at risk the child's well-being, education, physical or mental health, or spiritual, moral, or social development. Importantly, it states that everyone, children included, has the right to basic education and further education. Many would agree, Program Director, that as adults, we must also protect the children from being used to highlight and or settle political and social grievances. I am happy that the Department of Social Development is part of today's initiative. One of the duties of Parliament is to lead the transformation of our society. In the process, we ought to prioritize the right of children among the groups of vulnerable citizens. As such, we should work tirelessly to ensure that our children live in an environment that is conducive to their development. Universally, children tend to respond positively when they're exposed to education, sport, recreation, arts, cultural, and heritage activities, etc., etc. Critically, these programs also help us to combat substance abuse, gangsterism, and violence, amongst others. There is, however, a growing call for the parents to increase their support to their children's educational, sporting, and other activities. Parliament must rally society to place the rights and interests of children at the center of what society does. Program Director, this webinar has raised the importance of using knowledge to support Parliament in performing its functions. This work must continue. We are mindful of the fact that South Africa remains a highly unequal society where too many people live in poverty and too few people participate in the economy. This reality impacts the extent to which people are able to support and protect their children. In spite of this, Parliament has the responsibility to ensure that our limited public resources are utilized optimally to improve the chances of our children enjoying a better future. We appreciate the fact that in spite of the limited public resources, government has been able to provide child support grant to 12.8 million children, foster child grants to 356,000 children, and care dependency grant to 155,000 children. Program Director, please allow me to extend great appreciation for this initiative and to thank everyone who participated. We must make this the age of knowledge. We must create knowledge, share it in order to benefit more people, and use it to improve our current conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Masando, for your closing remarks and also outlining the way forward. Your insights and leadership, as always, is much appreciated. Also, thanks to all the presenters for your very insightful and well-organized presentations. Some of the issues discussed was an eye-opener to me, and I'm sure to the rest of the delegates. We will try our best to forward any questions sent by delegates to the relevant presenter on the Zoom link. In closing, I would also like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers behind the scenes, especially the staff from Unicef, Department of Social Development, the researchers from the Social Equity Cluster, and the admin team of the research unit, supported by IT and PCS. Thank you for the arrangements and hard work to make this event possible. Also, without the support of each and everyone present here, this event wouldn't have been possible. Our second part of the webinar will be on the 22nd of November, 2021, starting at 10, which will deal with government's treaty and development responsibilities to children and Parliament's role in ensuring compliance, strengthening of the system and the responses, addressing the data or deficits. With this, I would like to close the first part of the webinar series, and we sincerely hope to see you again on the 22nd of November at 10 o'clock. Please register on the info alert. All the best and have a great afternoon further. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wessel.
Thank you. Anything from you, Micah?
Just to compliment you, Program Director, great job, well done. Thank you to all honorable members and partners to be here this morning. Great step forward to provide a very meaningful and insightful session on the socioeconomic realization of rights of children and their situation, and to start deliberating what we can do better in partnership in terms of meeting children's rights better, with recognizing the role the different duty bearers play from the state to Parliament, civil society and others. So we are extremely grateful and honored to be part of this series And we will continue to be working closely with Parliament on the situation of children. Thank you so much.
Thank you and goodbye, everybody.